March 16, 1968. An unforgettable day in history. It was filled with screams and shouts. But while the Americans screamed for joy, Vietnam was filled with shouts of horror and terror. In 1968, Charlie Company, a unit of the 11th Brigade, entered the village of My Lai in Vietnam and murdered the villagers in cold blood. It was a dark evening, with over 500 Vietnamese, mostly women, children, and the elderly, losing their lives in the massacre. The brutality was severe. The villagers were raped, mutilated, and tortured by American soldiers, after which they were killed. And families were dragged from their homes, thrown into ditches, and executed. The story made headlines, and soon, gruesome photos of the killings began to circulate. This story is one of the pages in the dark chapter of the American war in Vietnam that has continued to haunt and interrupt attempts at reconciliation. Now, it may seem like the Vietnamese were the main victims of the Vietnam War, but in actual fact, lots of American soldiers also endured profound suffering. In the 1960s, America was very well known as a military superpower, and the communist Vietnamese in the North were known to be amateurish. Their soldiers were young boys who could never be prepared enough to fight against experienced American soldiers and were only given basic training. Eventually, they became known as the Vietcong. The inexperienced Vietnamese soldiers were armed with weapons given by the Soviet Union and China to use against American forces in the South. And because they weren't as skilled as the Americans, they adopted hiding as a key element in their combat approach. Members of the Vietcong would hide in the woods, mountains, and among innocent civilians, which made detecting them very difficult. After hiding, the Vietcong soldiers would position homemade booby traps, which killed thousands of Americans. Surprisingly, about 100 Americans died per week from these tactics. Interestingly, the guerrilla tactics of the Vietcong had a huge impact on both the effectiveness and morale of American soldiers. The Americans were always taken by surprise at each attack because, well, the Vietcong had only their feet and bicycles, while they had jeeps and tanks. But these ended up being cumbersome, and the Vietcong more mobile and agile, making them able to outflank and surround their enemy quite faster. This surprising turn of events, the traps, and the possibility of ambush every second of the day created a state of constant tension and fear in the American soldiers, which weakened their ability to perform simple tasks and led to many of them developing severe PTSD as veterans. As if that was not enough, hundreds of American soldiers were captured during the war. The treatment was terrible, and according to the survivors, being killed in battle would have been better. Now, if you enjoy the content, please don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications for more videos like this. The North Vietnamese brutally and systematically tortured American prisoners to force them to confess to war crimes and participate in staged propaganda activities, or to try to get military information. Even though the prisoners did their best to avoid cooperating, torture worked to push them beyond their endurance limits. The prisoners soon learned that any answer, even a false or misleading one, could temporarily end their unbelievable pain. And even though many of them felt guilty about giving answers, they still said as little as possible to preserve their lives. The torture was exceptionally cruel. Prison guards would bind the arms and legs of the American soldiers with tight ropes and then dislocate them. And oftentimes, they left men in iron footstocks for days or weeks. Extreme beatings were also common, which resulted in many deaths. Forced communist indoctrination was also a constant in the Vietcong prison camps. American soldiers who were prisoners always had to endure endless Radio Hanoi broadcasts and lectures during torture sessions. Lack of medical treatment was another life threat, which all the American prisoners had to face. And the filthy conditions added to their misery by attracting rats and insects and promoting diseases. The nutrition was horrible. It was never enough and was limited to thin pumpkin or cabbage soup, some bread and rice, and rotten or hairy meat. They were given cold food in the winter and hot food in the summer. They also had to cope with inadequate ventilation, no sunshine in their cells, and little clothing. Of course, the result was constant skin disease and sores. One of the most horrible exploitations of American prisoners took place in July 1966, when 52 American soldiers were forced to walk handcuffed in pairs through the streets of Hanoi to fuel the anger of the North Vietnamese public. As expected, the march turned violent, and many American prisoners were attacked and beaten like a case of a violent mob attacking defenseless captives. All of these made the thoughts of escape stronger in the American prisoners. But the harsh environment and hostile population surrounding prison camps offered little chance for escape. Still, some POWs tried, and many constantly planned for possible ways to escape. For example, Navy Lieutenant George Coker and Captain George McKnight escaped from Hanoi and made it 15 miles down the Red River before being recaptured. Both spent several days in irons and were transferred to Alcatraz, a small prison made specially for those the North Vietnamese wanted to isolate. At Alcatraz, mental torture joined physical hardship. The prisoners were isolated completely in tiny, dark, ill-ventilated dungeon-like cells, where they were kept in irons 15 or more hours each day. For instance, Navy Lieutenant Harry Jenkins spent 85 days in irons for communicating with another Alcatraz prisoner. Air Force Colonel Robbie Risner spent 10 consecutive months alone in a darkened cell, and Lieutenant Colonel Larson spent 18 months in a similar situation. In the end, North Vietnamese torture was unimaginably brutal and prolonged that nearly every American prisoner made a statement of some kind or spilled some secret one time or the other. John McCain, one of the prisoners who was forced to make an anti-American statement, later wrote that he had learned from experience and now believes that every man has his breaking point, and he had reached his in that period. In fact, only a few exceptionally resilient prisoners of war like John A. Dramisi survived captivity without ever cooperating with the enemy. Others who refused to cooperate under any circumstances, like Edwin Atterbury, were tortured to death. Also, there's James Stockdale, who attempted suicide out of fear of revealing details of the Gulf of Tonkin incident if tortured. He survived anyway, and didn't reveal the information to the enemy. Under these extreme conditions, the aim of the prisoners became to absorb as much torture as they could before giving in. To pass this spirit on, the prisoners developed an internal code by which new arrivals were instructed. Take physical torture until you are right at the edge of losing your ability to be rational. At that point, lie, do or say whatever you must do to survive, but you first must take physical torture. This was the golden rule, which came with the promise of eventually walking on the streets of gold in America when they were finally released. But this was the exact opposite of what happened. Unlike veterans of other wars, the American veterans did not return home to cheers and ceremonies. Most Americans wanted to forget the trauma of the Vietnam War and move on. As a result, the survivors were seen as a reminder of defeat and of a time that should be forgotten. So, some veterans who struggled with physical and psychological injuries often felt isolated from family and friends. Those who supported the war hated the veterans for losing the war, which left the soldiers feeling like outsiders in the society. Although many American veterans did have success after returning home, those who did not were often left to deal with their trauma alone, as though they were traitors instead of heroes, making it difficult to adjust to life back home after all they went through and all they had to endure for loyalty's sake at the enemy camp. The Vietnam War no doubt divided American society, but worse than that, the gruesome experience the soldiers had and the treatment they received upon return to America makes the war stand out. What do you think about the war and the experience of the American soldiers? Do let us know in the comments. Also, please like and subscribe to Binge History if you haven't. See you soon!